Your attention, please. I shall now speak. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to put out a review of what I would like the upcoming patch to be for January 2020. I wanted to kind of make it like an ongoing monthly series because I think it would be cool and stuff and whatnot. And basically, I guess my reasoning for doing this is that I think it's really easy to just Pepe point the dumbest things that the CDPR devs do every month on their balance changes. And trust me, I've been around long enough to know that there are a lot. But I think it's a lot more difficult to actually go in and say that, like, and thoroughly explain what could be done better where. And I think that it's an exercise worth doing. And I hope that this kind of gets people to think about balance in the sense of having a more direction, like more of a direction in terms of what they would want to see from the game, rather than just like me no like OP thing TM. And I think it would be cool. And also, who am I fucking kidding? I just feel like rambling too because I don't know, it's what I do or something. Yeah. So without further ado, I'm going to be going through the factions in the order that I sort of perceive them from strongest to the weakest in the meta. Not necessarily in terms of how well they're doing this season, but in terms of how much influence I think they have on the metagame right now. So I'm going to be starting off with Nilfgaard. Nilfgaard, very strong. In the way of the Witcher expansion, they weren't looking like they were going to be too hot, but then they just got crazy patch changes, and then they were looking pretty hot. And I think people are kind of just waiting to see Nilfgaard play out, since a lot of other decks were getting new tools. And then they kind of ended up being about as crazy as you would expect. They ended up being even better in a sense, given that I think that the other deck that was the most crazy in terms of its meta impact was Vi, and Nilfgaard is the natural counter to Vi in a lot of ways. Lockdown can just hard ruin Vi. Control, like, tall removals can hard ruin Vi. Assimilate is one of the few options for trying to take on Vi with an engine deck that actually works decently often. So not only are Nilfgaard just like extremely strong in a vacuum, but they're very well positioned within the meta. And I feel like that just kind of makes them overbearing. It's very difficult to beat Nilfgaard without just losing to everything else. And it's very difficult to beat Nilfgaard, period. You can't just beat Nilfgaard. You can beat some of the Nilfgaard decks. It's an extremely flexible faction that got overbuffed. So starting off, I will be undoing some of the prior buffs to some extent. Coup de Grace is an echo card. This card, before the Way of the Witcher, used to only deal 2 damage and cost 10 provisions. The buff that it received was absolutely insane. Like, this card saw competitive play in its old form. And this card gained 2 points, 1 provision, and reach. The reach is actually deceptively the most important part of this card. In a lot of situations, instead of bricking, you just ass pull a Hjalmar, or ass pull in fucking Angolim. Angolim's a card that exists. Or you can combine damage with something like a Slave Hunter to Kua 5. The fact that the 1 damage is not just more points, but also opens up the effect of this card to have more value in games, is kind of ridiculously crazy of a buff. Coup de Grace, ignoring the provision number, I would argue is still just almost vacuously. You could vacuously argue it to be the strongest echo card in the game in some situations. Coup on Joachim compares favorably to playing an amphibious assault on the unit that you are pulling from Joachim, regardless of the unit's provision costs. Like, even if Joachim rolls a 4, in theory, Coup on Joachim was still more efficient than playing Assault on the unit that Joachim would target. And Assault is a 13 provision card that carries a faction. So that is just ridiculously nuts. Of course, it's random. Of course, you only have one Joachim and you have 2 coups. But I think it does a lot to illustrate just how secretly many points this card is. In Assimilate Mirrors, I felt like the game would almost always come down to just who randomly drew coup round 1, because it was so cheap to play a coup and it was so many points that in order to legitimately contest the coup, you had to burn something that was really, really valuable, like a province, and the trades would often just not end up well for you. So I went for a quote-unquote lax nerf of 2 provisions. My coup costs 11. I don't hate the fact that this card has more reach. It was very tricky to use. You can still brick it occasionally in a short round. This is not a card that never bricks. But I think a lot of people were saying, oh, we could try it at 10 first. And I'm just kind of like, bullshit. This is like, I would argue this card is this is up there for potential best card in the game right now. This card is ridiculous. And it's too powerful. So it's getting nerfed. Another card that they made too powerful. Brothens is an interesting one to talk about. Brothens originally was a 4 for 11 that spawned a disloyal unit, not from your starting deck, but just from the pool. It got nerfed to a 3 for 11 on account of being in almost every Nilfgaard deck. And eventually, the card sort of fell out of favor, but was deemed to be too mid-rangey, just as a result of being able to be put in every deck. And it's not so much that the card was bad as much as Nilfgaard being not so great, and the card not really having a lot of support. So essentially what they did is they gave this card a point and a provision, which is another huge buff, obviously going on and on about coup. That doesn't sound like a huge buff, but coup is just such a crazy buff that a point and a provision to a card that was already sort of on a playable level. Like, this card wasn't unplayed, it was just in a lesser played faction. Like, that's still really crazy. Like, a lot of cards in this position would just get a point or a provision, or in some cases, like, a point for a provision to help them stick a little bit better. So the buff is really strong. They did add a condition to it, and I have really mixed feelings about it. The condition is that the disloyal unit has to come from your starting deck. And on one hand, I really understand why they did this. It was because Brothens, if they just made the card better, would get thrown into every deck. And they wanted to make this card more archetypal. And I think that making a card more archetypal is a really valiant effort. So, in that sense, I like the change. On the other hand, they basically just made the card so strong that the archetype became warping your deck to try to include this card, regardless of whether you were playing, obviously, Assimilate. Assimilate is the intended archetype for this card. You would be dumb to not play this card in Assimilate, even at 3 for 11. But also Enslave, also Lockdown, also Imposter. It felt like regardless of what your deck was, you tried to jam a Brothens in it. And yeah, the card was that good. So I'd like the card to not be that good. I'm really conflicted on how to change this card. I could see some benefits to sort of reverting the change in some capacity. But I ended up going with this same effect with 4 for 11. There is some amount of play to potentially bricking Brothens if only Informant is ran. And if you want to play around that, you have to include a second spy, which has some amount of cost to it. And I do think that the spirit of the change, thinking about it more, is net good. I'm a little bit biased on a lot of these fronts because obviously I built the Assimilate deck, and the Assimilate deck was kind of my baby. Although in the end, I definitely had to cross the line and say, yeah, some of these cards are just too ridiculous. And the Assimilate deck, at least the canonical version with the portal, can't afford to run a 4P. And in that sense, it would be really nice. Like, I considered like a 4 for 11 that could choose between a Disloyal from starting deck and like also being able to play an Emissary by default, because Emissary's like not exactly Province into Emissary is not exactly a broken play that would be auto included into every Nilfgaard deck, but it is still like a good play. Like with the Assimilate, it almost would be just shoved into Nilfgaard anyway, even if this card could just reliably play an Emissary. So in the end, I decided this card just needs a provision nerf, potentially even more than that. But I think it could be tried at 4 for 11. It would still be crazy good in Assimilate, but I have enough other changes to Assimilate coming that you can't really just gut every single card as much as it would be needed to properly nerf the faction, because if you do that many times over, suddenly you just don't have a faction. And Province is a more healthy card than a lot of the other cards that I'm going to be talking about in Nilfgaard, so I went pretty light on Province in the end. Next thing I'm going to talk about is a leader ability, which is Lockdown. I'm not really sure how to showcase Lockdown. I can build a Lockdown deck. This was going to go into my separate section for long-term changes, but unfortunately, Lockdown is really meta-relevant right now. This leader ability should not be in the game. It never should have been in the game. People who claim that it should be in the game are wrong. I'm just going to say it straight up. A lot of people will argue that Lockdown being in the game is a form of a failsafe, that Lockdown will only be ran if a truly degenerate combo deck is out there. First of all, as this meta has shown, it's just not true. Lockdown can beat... When I was playing Patricidal Fury against Lockdown, Lockdown was favored. Patricidal Fury, in theory, is a deck that can really function without its leader, especially since I was running no charge. That's like the only card that's like really Bloodthirst intensive. Like, decks without their leaders can still lose to Lockdown just from gaining some minor benefit from their leader that's cancelled when Lockdown... Like, Lockdown is a lower provision leader, sure, but you make up some of those provisions by knowing that the game is going to be played without leaders. So the leader is not as bad as it looks against normal decks, while it can completely, absolutely ruin any deck that actually tries to play as an archetype rather than plays as like a mid-rangey deck that has like some really concrete goal and really depends on the leader. The second problem with Lockdown is just that it's not fun. Like, there are two primary things in the game that differentiate like decks. One is factions, and the other is leaders. Like, to some extent you can swap cards, but by the time you pick a faction and then pick a leader, most of the cards that you put into your deck, assuming that you're building competitively, like, will sort of fall into place. Occasionally you will find two really different decks that take advantage of the same leader and sort of rely on different packages, but it's pretty rare. So basically, you're taking away half of the diversity of the game when you play Lockdown, because Lockdown's just like, no leaders. It's a really shitty move. I think it shows worse than ever now that Lockdown is at the forefront of the metagame. Lockdown Ball is unironically a top tier deck. Yeah, it's bad. I don't know what to say. I reworked Lockdown into another leader. Primarily because I had an idea for it. In most cases where I just say I want something yeeted, My word for it in my script is literally yeeted. Because I don't really view it as it would a net negative to the game, and it would be better if CDPR just came up with something to fill the place of it. However, Lockdown is like, first of all, it's an entire leader ability. I think it's the only case of me saying an entire leader ability needs to go. And secondly, I had a decent idea for a leader. And I think it's pretty difficult to come up with Nilfgaard leaders because it seems like whenever we get a new leader, it's just like lock in some new form that's just like K Controller. Like basically, I don't want to leave a leader in the hands of CDPR again after what happened with imprisonment, and even to some extent Imposter. Imposter is a really binary leader. Like it's really, really dependent on what your opponent is playing to get value. And those are the newest two Nilfgaard leaders. Make Freemed a leader again. Yeah, Freemed was a good leader. So I'm not sure how precisely to word this out to my Twitch chat because I'm playing two separate games here right now. One for Twitch folks and the other for the supposed maybe one day existent YouTube folks. And fuck, I'm tired. But basically, I guess I can just copy paste. I wanted to sort of okay, cool, I did it. So I'm not entirely. This was the most difficult thing for me to price out of my entire suggested changes. But the new leader, and I will have a patch notes in the description for the YouTube folks. So I'm stressing out about this more than I should because it's like Twitch people or whatever. Basically, the leader, I think the leader uses a template that I think is really cool. Has shown to work in a lot of successful reworks, which is basically permanent effect plus active ability. Things like Nature's Gift, I think, have shown to be successful in creating new archetypes. Whenever the leader is, whenever an enemy unit receives a status during your turn, explicitly during your turn, I don't want people going on Vincent 2.0. I very briefly ran some of these changes by a teammate, and kind of just as like proofreading, and realized Keck W, Vincented, whatever. My old suggestion for the active component of the ability was really stupid, but it doesn't exist anymore, Pepe Smile, so we're not going to get into that. Yeah, so passively, whenever an enemy unit receives a status during your turn, damage it by 1. And on order, you can lock the next enemy unit that gains a status this turn with a cooldown of 4. Cooldown, I feel like, is underutilized. I wanted to combine a cooldown component of an ability with a permanent component of an ability to make sort of like a really front-loaded Nilfgaard leader. Nilfgaard lacks a front-loaded leader currently in the game. So it would be really interesting to see it encourage like a more engine-oriented deck that really, really cares about round 1. And my idea for a lockdown ability would fit very well into that type of deck, as well as with my rework of Masquerade Ball, which is the next card that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm not really sure what to say about my rework other than I made sure that it would only work with negative status effects. That's why the second part of the effect is as wordy as it is. It's whenever an enemy unit receives a status during your turn. It's so that nothing Keck W gets locked because it got Vitality or Shield. The Vincent debate is a whole nother matter, and I go back and forth on it myself, but I just decided, no, it's a leader, and there's a way around it. I just don't want to be involved in it. I'd rather make something that encourages you to status things, rather than hope that your opponents play status. So that is my idea for a rework. I don't know precisely how strong it is, but I'm throwing it out there. Peanut Gallery will probably have opinions about that one. Someone mentioned in chat that all bronze spies just die. Yes, all bronze spies just die. That is intentional. The leader is meant to synergize to some extent with spies. And I also think that that is not a bad thing, because currently there is a problem with spies clogging board space. A leader that actively synergizes with spies and simultaneously kills off spies will sort of prevent that problem. Because decks that are more spy-oriented will use that leader, and then the spies will die off. You can't coup? Yeah, not being able to coup spies is a little bit of a downside in that front. I will admit that. Like, there's a tiny bit of anti-synergy, but realistically, you can still coup Roderick, you can still coup Joachim, you can still queue cards that you Fergus or Mage Torturer, and those cards I think will be included in the deck. A little bit of a hint on my ball rework. Moving on to the ball rework. Masquerade Ball. This card is this card exists. It's still really, really good. It's the only card in the game to cost 15 provisions. And Masquerade Ball don't give a shit. Yeah. It's so I guess to give a more technical breakdown of this card, the more I play with Masquerade Ball, the more I don't dislike it entirely, to be quite honest. Originally, I was just like, what the fuck is this doing in my game? Not my Gwent, not my Nilfgaard, not my Gwent Re. And then cards got crept to the point where scenarios weren't just standalone egregious for being scenarios. Ball was still egregious relative to the other scenarios. And then Ball got nerfed again. And then Ball was still egregious to the other scenarios, but by that point, my brain had kind of just cemented Ball with Nilfgaard. And admittedly, Ball is a skillful card. It sucks to admit this, but Ball legitimately is hard to time when you're being pushed. Ball legitimately can benefit a lot from Aristocrat chaining, but Aristocrat chaining often requires you to mull golds, and it can be difficult to set up reliably. There are cool things that Ball does. I still think that being able to play Ball in a deck that runs 0 poisons, even though it's my favorite pastime, and I've built a lot of decks doing that, including the Assimilate pile, but also some other ones. I built just like a 0 poison control Nilfgaard during the Master Mirror expansion at some point. That worked out pretty well. Being able to do that is stupid. Like, it's a card that takes advantage of poison. And is like the cornerstone for a poison deck. Additionally, making it this easy to just proc an entire scenario while playing 2 poisons off of a scenario is too easy and too rewarding for comboing for chaining aristocrats. Like, chaining aristocrats already lets you play out an entire scenario in 1 turn, which is a big benefit. But when you furthermore kill a unit with the chapters 1 and 2, it pretty much just makes any point swing ever possible. You can let your opponent get ahead by like 30 points in round 2, and then play it Ball, and then play 2 aristocrats. And then they will have burned something too big by that point for that trade to have been feasible for your opponent. So ultimately, I think this card is just more value than one card should have in it. Or maybe not necessarily more value, but it's not so much just that it's value in a long round, it's simultaneously just wins a short round. So I made Masquerade Ball more long round oriented. I made it work better with my new Lockdown rework. And I also made it still technically possible to do some poison plays, but only if you're actually running poisons yourself and chaining tutor aristocrats into cards that poison, rather than just another aristocrat. So my change, I'm hyping it up, but it's not really that big of a change. I changed Chapter 1. That was all I changed to Masquerade Ball. Didn't change the point value. I think this card will still be extremely good. Instead of spawning a Fangs of the Empire, it spawns a Mage Torturer, which you'll notice is actually an upgrade to a 5p card. And I do genuinely believe that it makes the scenario weaker. as well as less flexible, more of a long round tool explicitly than just a card that you can play 2 aristocrats and automatically get insane value. The advantage of the Mage Torturer, it has Assimilate. Assimilate's pretty cool with the scenario. The scenario comes in with a built-in Assimilate proc for the Mage Torturer. In a long round, you can proc it quite a bit. It gives a unit spying. With lockdown, you can immediately lock that unit. Chat is saying this instantly kills the card. I disagree. I think this card will still be surprisingly good. I don't really think it's fair to say that it kills the card. Became another passive Flora. Yeah. I mean, scenarios are hard. I don't know how to feel about scenarios. Scenarios are genuinely a very difficult problem. 15 provisions. Yeah, passive Flora could cost 15 provisions and it would see some play. I would argue that this card still has more standalone powerful cards. Fangs of the Empire is really, really good. And you can still just chain like Roderick into Cupbearer or Joachim into Fangs, etc., etc. Like, you can still use this card to cheat the poison mechanic. It's just you have to be a little bit more creative with how you do it. Like, a big part of this card's value, on top of already being a scenario and being the most raw value of the scenarios, was that it cheated the poison mechanic, and it can still do that. Like, I don't really think it's fair to just suddenly compare it to another scenario. Like, ultimately, this card is just too ubiquitous. Something has to be done about it. It was the best fix I could think of. I also considered Seditious Aristocrat because I thought it fit more directly into the card, but then I realized it's an aristocrat, and that kind of defeats the purpose of scenario unless you make it spawn it, and then that kind of defeats the purpose of Seditious Aristocrats, which is the deployability. Remove Aristocrat from Duntine so you can't full ball in one turn. First of all, you still can full ball in one turn. Second of all, no. Roderick is an aristocrat. The card's a cool support card. I like Roderick. Ball is the broken part of Ball. Like, you can still full combo with Joachim into any aristocrat. You can still full combo with potentially coup shenanigans, potentially even double cross. Which I will be changing slightly, but not full reworking because it's not as immediate of a problem as Lockdown. Lockdown I just view as a problem. Why not just have it spawn as an assassination instead of the second thing? At that point, that card would be worse. Like, this card is meant to support a status archetype, right? Like, assassination is still weaker than the second Fangs if you're playing this card in a poison deck. The big difference to the power level of this card is that you now have to play it in a poison deck. I think y'all are underestimating the value of Mage Torturer. It's not that bad of a card, especially in a deck that is going to be wanting to play Spying, which can essentially equate to 2 damage and a lock with a lockdown ability. Like, you need reliable sources of statuses that make sense to play with locks to get the most value out of lockdown. And you could potentially still play this card even outside of lockdown. I don't know. At this point, that's my rework, so I would like to move on because there are more changes to Nilfgaard. Nilfgaard's a good faction. Oh, this will be fun. Oh, the Reddit Timmies are gonna hate me for this one. Alba Armored Cavalry. I'm reverting Alba Armored Cavalry to Alba Unarmored Cavalry. I'm a competitive player, so fuck you too. The reason for that, originally this was a 4 with 1 armor. I want it to be a 5 with no armor. It's the best balance point. You can't tell me honestly. Like, I think a lot of people see Nilfgaard and they see Locke and they think really fucking lazy. And to some extent, I agree. But you can't tell me that at this point Locke isn't a fundamental mechanic of Nilfgaard. And you can't tell me that the best Locke options being like a 4 for 5 will actually result in anyone ever playing Locke. This card was really not good before. And to me, a 5 for 5 is about at the point where a Locke card can legitimately trade with a lot of engines. Like a 4 for 4 engine eating a Locke trade's about even. Potentially a little bit better if you have like some aristocratic stuff set up, like a Thirsty Dame. But potentially also misses the target. Or in the case of Ramon, potentially you'll be stuck with 2 of them. And your opponent may not have many targets. So there does need to be some amount of like slight payoff to locking. The 1 armor is overbearing. The 1 armor comes into play a lot more often than you would think. They're just random damage, whether it be random damage or needing to hit a unit. 1 armor can turn into 1 point, like surprisingly often, and at that point this card just becomes kind of crazy efficient regardless of what it's locking, as long as it's locking anything relevant at all. You could also just make this a 4-1 or even a 4-2 if you wanted the card to be really weak again. I would argue that it's probably still better than Alba Armored Cavalry's current form. 5-1 is kind of ridiculous. But personally, I would like to see the card tried at 5. There's nothing inherently unfair about this card, like I think a lot of people are whining about. It is a pretty basic Nilfgaard card. They finally got some decent bronzes, sorry. Yeah. Let's see, other changes I made. These were more cards that I didn't like rather than cards that were too powerful. Like, I think we're finally through the cards that I'm nerfing for power reasons. These are more personal matters. Viper Witcher. I'm nerfing Viper Witcher by a bleeding. This card is ridiculously efficient. It does not get enough credit for how efficient it is. This card is pretty easy to play at Adrenaline 6. And it is 6 for 5 that can bleed anything. An automatic mulligan target that can potentially be redrawn later. And a Colgrim. That's really good. I would like Viper Witcher to be less good. To me, Clog as an archetype is kind of gross. I don't like Clog being pure Clog. But even if you are going to have Clog be a real archetype, I think that means that the weakness should be round 1. Because in round 1, you are paying points up front in order to worsen the quality of your opponent's stack. And with Viper Witcher, you're kind of just playing a decent vanilla, where you're not really losing much ground at all by playing the Viper Witcher. And on that front, I think this card is too good. So I want it to have more of a cost if you are going to play Clog. And I also have some other changes to hopefully push Colgrim in a less Cloggy direction and a more hyper-thinny direction. Because Colgrim was a card Colgrim to me is one of the biggest disappointments of the expansion, because I was really excited for it in hyper-thin, and then it made more sense to play it in Clog, and then they released more Clog cards. And yeah, it was not fun to just have games decided based on what my hand was in round 1. Further changes. This is pretty rare, but Viper Witcher Mentor, I just gave up on this card. The Viper Witcher package as a whole, there are 2 sets of Witchers that I just flat out couldn't see the identity for out of the 4. Like, to me, the ST Witchers and the SK Witchers, very consistent on their theme. If I had to rework one of them, I would know what to try to do. the Viper Witchers and the Griffin Witchers, to me, just seem like random sets of cards. They don't really play with each other very well. Like the Viper Witchers all at least have something to do with deck manipulation, but they all want different things to happen to be set up. I guess to some extent, the Viper Witcher Mentor and the Viper Witcher Alchemist both want a really good card to be on top of your opponent's deck, but the Viper Witcher Mentor has, like... it's so awkward to set up. It's so awkward to set up. And this card is super problematic. Like, so many games are decided by this Adrenaline 2 effect, and you not drawing your best card in round 1, and your opponent just randomly ass-pulling points, so that you can actually potentially lose round 1 to Colgrim. And then they just have their setup, and you don't draw the answers, and you lose. I really hate this card. My first attempt was to just change the Adrenaline effect, so that if you were willing to commit something like playing an entire Warret the Seer in order to set up this card, then fine, you could play it. And then maybe the Adrenaline would have some different minor effect in addition to it. But I hate this card so goddamn much, I didn't want to put up with it. I'm saying throw it away. I don't know anyone who actually likes this card, to be honest. Yeah, I gave up on it. And I don't think giving up on cards is a very healthy thing to do, because realistically, the CDPR, if I were in the position of the CDPR devs, in the position of the CDPR devs, I would probably have to do something to that card. And that's where saying, here's my solution relative to whatever they put out, kind of breaks apart, right? Like, but I genuinely would rework that card. And the problem with reworking a card is that you need a direction. And to me, it's not clear what the Viper Witcher direction is. And I'm not CDPR, so I can't just deem my direction to be the direction. I don't want this to get into full-on, like, custom Gwent mode of just me creating custom cards that wouldn't realistically mesh well with already existing concepts. Like, in the case of Lockdown, the support for an archetype like that would already be there, even though I built a reworked Lockdown and I built a reworked Masquerade Ball. In the case of Viper Witchers, I'm just not sure what I would want that card to be, in terms of how it would interact with the existing cards. And it doesn't help the fact that 3 out of 4 of the Viper Witcher cards are really unhealthy for the game. Like, the Viper Witcher to a lesser extent, at least the Viper Witcher is a vanilla, and it has a direction, and it knows what it wants to do, and it's not crazy swingy. But the Alchemist and the Mentor are terrible designs. In the end, I yeeted the Alchemist too. I just don't like this card. I think it's a net negative to the game. So I said goodbye. And by the time I decided, no, I don't want to deal with the Alchemist or the Mentor, at that point I've deleted half the archetype. So it's not really fair for me to say, like, oh yeah, it should be this instead. Like, at that point I have changed enough to the point where I can't realistically know what CDPR would have envisioned for the game. So I kind of just gave up on it. Like, something should happen to those cards. To me, that's more anti-casual than anti-competitive. Personally, I would absolutely hate going up against those cards as a casual. They are designed to not let you play your deck. Yeah. But, like, they're dangerously close to competitive, too. I wouldn't call them, like, competitive, but they're definitely both good options off of Gorther, which is competitive. Obviously, another card, Warret. Originally, I mentioned this card as, like, if I was willing to play a literal 7 for 8 to set up my Alchemist and my Mentors, like, in theory, that's fine from a value perspective. God damn, I hate this card. Like, playing the first 2 weeks where people hadn't figured out that this card wasn't good enough yet on average, And just losing so many games on the spot to this, just randomly from it being drawn round 1 and me not having a way to tutor the card that it showed, and the card happening to be a really good steal. It was frustrating, man. I would like, to me, this whole archetype was kind of a disappointment. It was a lot of cards that weren't good enough, and if they were good enough, would be terrible for the game. Like, given that the expansion came out 1 month ago, I'd like to see something else attempted to be put here. And again, I think that's sort of where, like, a reworking archetypes would be good. I might tackle it at some point, but it felt sort of out of scope for, like, a patch change wish list. Other changes I made, for the short term, this is yet another new Nilfgaard card that I don't like, but Ivar Evil Eye. I at least had an idea for a short-term balance change that I would make if I was a CDPR dev. I changed the power. I actually nerfed the card by making it 5 strength. Yeah, Ivar Kek W. I made Ivar 5 strength, and I switched the Adrenaline 2 to Adrenaline 3. The idea of this change would be to turn it into more of a mid-range card. It makes it not incredibly as god-awful to play if you are using it for the Adrenaline effect, and it makes it 2 points less good when you are swapping this unit's power with an enemy unit, plus potentially removal setup value if you wanted to deal 4 damage to the thing after. So I think it makes the card better. I still hate the variance of this effect. The value of this effect against monsters is so different from the value of this effect against literally any other faction. And also TA is a big part of it too, in a lot of cases. And like the thing is, if you ever make this card bad enough that it's not somewhat of a mainstay, it just becomes another surprise card. Like, it becomes another Turgv type card, but pre-Turgv nerf. Turgv's a solid card now, design-wise. It's, I don't see it being good for the game long-term, but I do think that will at least help tame this card. So that was my change. It makes it harder to use the pre-Adrenaline effect, more mid-rangey and playable against other control decks that don't go tall, and like less good when it does get the pre-Adrenaline effect. Double Cross. Double Cross, I nerfed it by a provision. It went from 17 to 16. I don't even feel like pulling the leader up. It's a pretty simple change. Basically, I think the leader's a little too good. It's not the most interesting leader ever. I don't particularly have any attachment to the leader. It's even a 2-card per turn leader, which I think is kind of silly, given that CDPR a while ago went on a 2-card per turn purging spree and purged some leaders that I personally thought were good for the game almost, I would say. Out of just there being a few 2-card per turn leaders that were blatantly poorly designed. Like, to me, it didn't have to be made a hard rule. They just kind of made it a hard rule because it gave them an excuse to go in and change a whole bunch of leaders, which was still not good for the game. So it's hard to fault them. But because of that, it's like, yeah, Double Cross could exist in the game and it would be fine. There's nothing wrong with it from a design perspective, in my opinion. So I just gave it a nerf. I think the leader's a little good. Like, in Assimilate, the leader is so nuts. It would absolutely still be the Assimilate leader of choice at 16. And you can kind of just play it in mid-rangey leaders, and it's not a super fun leader to play against, so it's like, I would rather it be slightly less meta-relevant. Colgrim's another card that I minorly tweaked. This is in another effort to make Colgrim a hyper-thin card and not a milk card. Colgrim I actually buffed from 1 power to 2, and then gave it 9 provisions to 10. The idea of this change, the raw value of the card almost goes slightly up, and the stickiness of the card goes slightly up, but the most important thing is that you can't renew it. I don't like Colgrim being renewed. Like, the big reason Colgrim became a clog deck and not a hyper thin deck, which in my opinion is just inherently the wrong way to go with the Colgrim archetype, is because you could play enough options for eating a tall removal that in many cases your opponent would miss one or two answers as a result of you clogging them. And then Colgrim, Renew, Fion, Kingslayer would just take off the game, and there was very little the opponent could do about it. To me, that's not really a healthy design, that the entire deck's source of points is Colgrim. In Hyper Thin, the card would be a lot more fair, because if Colgrim does just meet his end at a tall removal, the game doesn't end on the spot. There is a backup package of Hyper Thin cards that also play in a similarly tall distribution and benefit from the Colgrim eating the removal. So it's a much more natural fit for an archetype. Yeah, this card will be much less binary. It doesn't just win or lose you the game on the spot based on whether it lives or dies. It will be extremely good if it lives, but I think that's fine if you set it up enough. Moving on, much shorter. Much shorter from here on out. But the second faction I'm addressing between Skellige and Monsters is actually Monsters. In terms of meta relevance, Skellige and Nilfgaard are like the kings right now. But Monsters to me is the more meta warping faction, and especially given how heavy-handed I was on Nilfgaard. If I just printed the Nilfgaard nerfs and nothing else, you better believe that yeah, that. Yeah. Yeah, that card's pretty good. Keltolis is also popping up. I think mostly just because there was so much Nilfgaard and Keltolis had a better chance against it. And people wanted a fourth faction really badly, and Nilfgaard and Northern Realms and SY were not looking good. Especially SY. So on that front, I guess we'll start with the obvious change, Vi. There were a couple of options for Vi. One was nerf the base power slightly, one was nerf the base power drastically. Like, I could see both making this card 6 and making this card 7 as viable changes. But I ultimately decided that the best change was actually to change the base power increase down from 3 to 2. Already, gaining another gold card as a result of a Death Wish is a pretty powerful effect. It does cost a consume. But at 2, there's still plenty of incentive to just spam Vise. I think that the reason that the Strengthen change, in my opinion, is better than the Raw Power change is because, ultimately, if you nerf the Raw Power of Vi, at some point, if you do, assume that you did it enough, assume that Vi is, like, weak in round 1 now. Ultimately, if Vi gets the red coin and starts playing a few Vise, and then passes, and then suddenly you have the round control, if you're the wrong deck, if you're like a mid-rangey deck, like Patricidal Fury or something like that, and you don't play like many options for tall removals, you're gonna have a bad time still against tons and tons of big Vise in round 3. I think that the condition that the deck is playing for is too insane for the current state of Gwent. I don't think it's reasonable that if this deck gets set up in the way that it wants to, that it can play like 5 different copies of 20 to 30 point Vise in a round 3. I think that the ultimate condition needs to be scaled down rather than just trying to compensate for it, because with round dynamics, some decks just flat out won't be able to compensate for it. Like, you can reasonably expect decks, if Vi is a real thing, to easily be packing 1 tall removal without much cost to their deck. By the time you're running 2, a lot of decks are going to be suffering in terms of viability if they are not able to properly fit the techs. And then by the time you have people literally running bullshit like Yurden and Spores, just to, like, fucking beat this card. Cards that, like, show very little value outside of that specific niche. Like, it's not something you want to be promoting. Like, I think it's more important to go after the strengthen, and just lower the ceiling, personally. Base power from 8 to 9 to 10 is what my chat's saying. That's not what I did. I lowered the provisions by 2. If you make the base power too big, then this card still just becomes like a really big round 1 threat. And it can still push really effectively. You're getting a lot, like, the nerf is not nearly as big as it sounds. And also, I don't think this is a card that should be seeing competitive play. Like, if you overcompensate for a strengthen nerf too much, this card will still just be on top again. This card will never be balanced. This card will either swing by a crazy amount, or it'll just not see the light of day. And to me, the better option is not see the light of day. I tried to, like, be conservative enough with my change, but yeah, just delete the card. I honestly kind of agree. I don't really. I might just be trying to appease, like, my role playing as the devs too much, by saying that that's how I would change the card. I view this card as inherently flawed, to be honest. This game is not set up well to handle Siri Dash. I mean, Siri Dash was a card in Old Gwent, and I guess that's sort of the thing that's convincing me that something like Vi in theory could be okay. Siri Dash was by no means a broken card in Old Gwent, but the game was just set up so differently. Like this, there are so many more neutral tutors that are balanced in a way that does not account for effects like Vi at all. Like, so many cards would have to be rebalanced to adjust for the fact that you can tutor cards that are playable multiple times rather than simply tutoring the golds that will be subtracted from your dex value when you play them. There are a lot of changes you can make to this card, but ultimately I consider it to be kind of futile effort, because the reality is that playing a Vi and then playing a tutor and then playing a tutor, like, doesn't make for very good solitaire. Like, even something like Kiki Queen is just far more interesting than Vi. I would much rather lose to this than this, even if it's like a similarly disgusting amount of points, given, like, if you're unable to manipulate the round properly. This deck is obviously also much more flexible, and part of the problem is how good it is. This card wouldn't be as much of a problem if it's bad, but to me, this card can only ever be a problem, just because of the sheer numbers of tutors, and, like, this card just exasperates me, man. Just fucking nuke the thing already. I don't know. Other buffs or other changes for monsters are actually in the form of buffs. I was pretty conservative with what I buffed, because Vi and to a lesser extent Kelly were by so much the dominant strategies for monsters, with like a super weird ass meta, that it's difficult for me to say that the other cards from Way of the Witcher were too weak. Stuff like Koschei, for example, I have seen sometimes be worth good points, even though it seems really clunky and probably not good enough in its current state. I would still be hesitant to buff them, especially given that we just suffered through Vi existing. Another card that I would consider buffing but would be too hesitant to, especially without my own ability to test, would be Succubus. Succubus I'm more confident is weak than Koschei, but again, it is sort of a solitary card. Like, they're cards that you have to work a lot harder to set up than Vi, and I think that that's cool. And they're also a lot more prone to being bled than Vi, and I think that's cool. But they're just not problems that I really want to tackle right now. The card that I can confidently say, because it works differently enough from Vi, and it was just super eclipsed from Vi, that I would like to buff is Chimera. Chimera, when I initially read this card, I read it differently. I didn't read boost all copies of a consumed unit that's in the unit's row by 1. I just read boost all copies of the consumed unit by 1. And I was like, Pog, that'll probably be pretty good. My response wasn't like, holy shit, that's broken. It was like, cool, good card. Having actually played with Chimera, it's possible that that's like being a little too generous. Like 13, you can get a 13 for 5 with this card decently reliably. It is possible to play more tokens than that, but in my opinion, this card is trying to be a payoff, and it's not really a payoff. Like 13 for 5 sounds good on paper, but you spent like 2 turns or maybe like a turn and an inefficient leader like Arrakis Swarm to play out a row full of tokens, and then you're relying on a 5 provision card to carry your long round 3. And if you're playing a Swarm deck, you're looking for a longer round rather than a shorter round generally. Because your cards standalone tend to really, really break. And that's just like not good enough. It also eats a token, so you're worsening your other Swarm payoffs in the process of doing that. It's just a very underwhelming card. So the change I ended up going for was 4 for 6, remove the row restriction. The idea being that, in most cases, even if you have like a Doldulok or something, you might just be sneaking 2 extra points, even if your rounds are split in a way where that change is not super beneficial. Sometimes you will just end up with tokens on the opposite row. But basically, the archetype needs to be more defined. Chimera is just too mediocre of a card to see play right now. It needs to be able to really be paid off or really be denied to actually be a more interesting card. I feel like this card was I feel like CDPR was a little bit too scared to print a bronze payoff, because obviously 4 for 6, if you compare it to Bone Talisman, if all of your units are the same type of token, which is mostly possible-ish in like a Plague Maiden deck or an Arrakis Swarm deck, suddenly this card is sort of like a Bone Talisman +3 in unit form that can sort of proc Thrive, although the assumptions start getting mixed up there, because if all of the units are the same type of token, you don't have Thrives. It is a big creep on like some of the Swarm payoffs. It's comparable to Morvud. That's what made me decide on 4 for 6. If you're playing Plague Maidens, the card is on the like basically just 2 points and 2 provisions off of Morvud, but it's more flexible. You can play it in a drone deck too. And just having a critical mass of payoffs is good. I could honestly see 4 for 6 being too conservative. I kind of wonder if maybe my initial gut was right. I doubt that 4 for 6 will make the card too strong. I think if anything, it'll still be too weak. But I think it's at least a valid attempt at a buff, because then it at least like aggressively pushes the archetype, and it makes you sometimes feel like, Pog, I got a 20-point Chimera, as opposed to, yay, 13 for 5 in the long round where I'm keeping a bronze. It's like, it feels like a lack of a deck to me. Like, it doesn't feel like you're ever really getting a payoff. So that is my suggestion for that card. If you wanted to be more ambitious and like make Swarm good, I honestly think this card could have been printed without the restriction. But if this card is, if like this is another card sort of like Vi that's really fragile, because it's a bronze and you can play 3 of them, and it is the payoff for the deck, this card will always be good in the deck that you put it in. There's a very tiny margin between like very strong playable card that is balanced and way, way, way too good. So you have to be careful with Chimera, like genuinely. But I would like to see Chimera be tried to be pushed. This card is really cool. I like the design of it a lot. Like, and again, it's a Way of the Witcher card, so that's why I'm talking about that one. But it is a really cool Way of the Witcher card. In addition to the Way of the Witcher cards being new, the Way of the Witcher cards have the benefit of a lot of them being really cool. I still stand by that Way of the Witcher was the best expansion we've had, despite it leading to a pretty yikes meta. But I mean, that pretty yikes metas are common after expansions. At least Gwent expansions, Pepe Smile. Might have something to do with testing. Next up, we have Skellige. I got pinged again. Oh, what up? Oh, never mind. Not on topic. Gotta stay focused. Gotta do the thing. So Skellige, this might surprise some people. I made one balance change to an actual Skellige card. There are a lot of indirect nerfs to Lippy in the neutrals. The only Skellige card I changed was Hernkaduk. This is the only actual Skellige card I targeted. Instead of healing adjacent units by 3, it now heals adjacent units by 2. Basically, my idea behind this is the card would still be very efficient. That's point 1. With cards just being blatantly good point plays, generally not feeling great for the game. This one's at least a little more interesting than some of the others that exist in the game. But to make up for it, it's just that crazy powerful. It doesn't really feel good that you have decks that are like Warriors and then try to jam Hernkaduk somehow, or like Lippy and then jam Hernkaduk somehow. Which in the case of Lippy, I think that's a little more inevitable because the Lippy package is so expensive and so set in stone in terms of like core cards that you're kind of left with filler for the rest of the deck. But yeah, Hernkaduk is crazy. Not drawing it can lose you games, despite it being an 8p card, just because you're lacking the Hernkaduk that you're counting on to carry your deck. In a lot of cases. And furthermore, the other justification I have for this change is that in an actual Bear Witcher deck, the order nerf wouldn't matter as much because the units would stay damaged in the case of healing Bear Witchers, and that could be useful for Bear Witcher mentors. It's kind of a weak argument. Obviously, it's still a nerf, and this card is probably more core to that deck, so it kind of sucks. I could definitely see Bear Witcher Mentor or Bear Witcher Quartermaster getting a slight buff, or even Bear Witcher Adept, I suppose. Those cards are cool. I like them. I think that could happen, but they're relevant enough and playable enough and feel functional enough that I didn't target them. Obviously, this has been long enough already, so I haven't gone off on those cards. So that is my change. Notable cards that I didn't change probably are not going to shock anyone. Sarah, Slippy, Herald on Crate. I think those are the 3 cards that I could see people wanting to be nerfed that are actual Skellige cards. The others are pretty fair. I could also see people potentially wanting an Arnagod buff. This card was not as big of a letdown as Archgriffin or Fallen Rayla, although saying letdown is pretty generous because I knew both of those cards would suck upon arrival. But Arnagod is still, in my opinion, a letdown. It's also, I think, a little over-reliant on like the Uber Cheese deck, and it kind of just feels like some decks like either can beat it or they can't. That's my primary reason for not buffing this card, is it just doesn't feel like a super healthy-ish card. I would like this card more if it could be splashed a little bit better, but I'm not really sure how to buff it in a way where it's like I don't want the Battle Trance, Sakura, Sigsrite nonsense to be the Arnagod deck and have it be too good. Because I think with how this card is currently designed, that is genuinely the best deck to put this card in. And it's just not something I would want to encourage too much from a game design perspective. So I didn't tackle this card either. Moving on, we have ST. ST got fairly minor changes, but they did get some nerfs. The biggest nerf I made was to Doblathana Sentry. Of the movement engines, believe it or not, the movement engines all have an inherent cost to them, except for Doblathana Sentry. Doblathana Sentry at worst trades with a removal, but there are so many ways to play this card out of removal range, whether it be a single matron buff or council or TA, or hand buffs even potentially. Depending on what your deck does, there are a lot of flexible ways for Sentry to just say no. And this card is 5 provisions, and if it lives, it just hard solos around more often than not. So I like the movement. I like the design of movement a lot. The more I play with movement, I pulled a complete 180 on movement. I thought movement would be one of the dullest archetypes of the expansion, because I saw Gaten and Gezrus, and I saw Swarm, not movement, which to some extent has panned out as people have realized that Guerrilla Tactics is suboptimal compared to Precision Strike and Deadeye. But right now, every deck still splashes movement, and I think that's cool. I think that's fine. I think decks playing movement is not bad if they're running the full movement package, but I think that this is the pivotal card, and I think this is the free real estate card, to the point where it's like, I would want this card to cost something to where it's actually a commitment to play the card, and it can't just be thrown in with with barely enough mid-range cards that will make this card automatically good when it happens to stick. I want it to be expensive enough that you try to protect the card rather than trade with removal, or sometimes they don't have the removal and lol Keck W. And that to me is 6 provisions. Conveniently, this is a 5p card, and 6 provisions is the Pits of Hell. Doblathana Sentry, good enough card that I could see it being played at 6. But it will severely hurt the card, and I think that that's good. I think right now this card is too strictly upside. It just automatically, if you stick this card, every engine just lives. And it's multiple points per turn. Some decks just don't even run an answer for this card, or run an answer for this card when it's counseled. And you just start sticking engines like mad, and it's crazy. And I think that a lot of hate has been directed towards Catwitcher when it's really the Sentry that in terms of raw engine value is carrying the deck, and doesn't really have any cost associated to it. My other changes, Gezrus. Gezrus got a very small nerf. I think that the power level of this card is actually exactly right, but I think that it's a little bit too sticky. I made this card a 4 for 11. The idea is that right now you need 1 Sentry or 1 Matron to play this card outside of traditional removal range. And that is very, very little when you run tons and tons of those. This card auto trading with Heatwave is really, really good. And especially if, spoilers, there's a Heatwave nerf. Especially if decks decide to go in a slightly less removal-oriented oriented route. I don't really want this card just hard auto-living. I think it should at least be a bit of a challenge to play this card outside of removal range. Still, all you need is to go, Matron into Sentry, and you've pretty much accomplished a Gezrus that plays above 5. But that's at least some amount of work. I don't actually see this card, this card doesn't hard carry long rounds as much as you'd think it would. It's really, really good in a round 2 push. In a round 2 push, you can often just, with Precision Strike or Deadeye, just jam your cards, and then jam Gezrus. And the fact that it works end of turn is really good. But you have to engineer that scenario, and your opponent's going to expect you to try to engineer that scenario, and they have time to respond accordingly to some extent. I don't think the card is too good, but I would like it to be more answerable. Other changes, a lot of people will want Justice to be nerfed. I didn't directly nerf Justice. I went after Mahakam Volunteers a little bit. I changed them from 4 to 5 to 3 for 4. The idea is basically that this is one of the easiest summon conditions of the Thinning Bronzes out there. I don't want to directly nerf Justice for 2 reasons. One, Novigradian Justice is a payoff card for dwarves. This card deserves to be insane in a dwarf deck, if you're building a dwarf deck. Dwarves are shitty enough. Second reason is that this card feels good to play. I don't want Justice to suddenly just not be an option in decks. Right now, the problem with this card is that it's too high rolly. This card is on the trickier side to tutor, and this card can just be 13 points whenever you want them, and that can really threaten people out of rounds. In terms of raw efficiency, when you factor in how hard this card is to draw and the potential to miss it and spend provisions on volunteers and such like that, it's not the craziest card ever, to be honest. Like, I don't really view it as like a super duper game warping card. But I do view it as like 2 hit or miss. And by nerfing volunteers, you're losing 2 fewer provisions when you don't draw Justice because you're just not playing the 4Ps. If you decide to not play the volunteers as a result of not drawing the Justice. And you have to be a little more creative with your dwarves if you want to get the maximum potential point swing out of this card. Like, it would be something like a Mahakam Guard. If you wanted to play like really high tempo with this card, otherwise you would have to set up something a little more engine-y, like a Pyrotech or a Miner. I think the Cleavel's Muscle and the 10 provisions are both fine. I don't think this card is poorly designed. It's flexible-ish. It's kind of a cool card. It's a spell too. I like how it plays into Gord. But it deserves a bit of a nerf. It's also in 2 factions. That's a good point. Justice is completely fine in Syndicate. I forgot about the fact that it was in 2 factions, but yeah. So, completely unnerfed for SY, which I think is how it should be. Let's see. Fuck, I lost my tab again. Oh yeah, Precision Strike. I nerfed Precision Strike by a provision. It was 14p, and it's now 13p. Precision Strike is a crazy efficient leader. It builds a lot of cool decks. It also builds unitless decks. I'm very conflicted on how to feel about the leader itself, but it's a solid design. It's definitely unique in terms of what it does. But it's too good. Basically, Precision Strike was at 1.16 provisions, and Sentinel was 5 instead of 4. And then Provision Strike was so crazy good, and there were enough ways to use the damage as damage, and some stuff like Shiro wanted flexible damage, that Sentinels were being cut. So like Provision Strike got a big nerf at some point, and then eventually Sentinels got buffed again on a later patch. And now this leader is basically the same leader that was deemed OP, which is kind of confusing to me, and the only caveat is you have to play Sentinels, which in a lot of like with the current meta doesn't really feel like much of a caveat. Like Shiru's not very desirable right now. And there's like even more reason to want tokens with stuff like Gaten and Gezrus. So yeah, the leader's really, really good raw value. And it makes tokens, and it adds to your control, which is very, very inflexible with ST, given that it's pretty much Rebuke and maybe a Heat Wave. And suddenly it becomes super flexible. I think that the power of the leader should be acknowledged with a low provision number. You could nerf Deadeye too, or even Feign Death. I think Feign Death is a card that you could consider targeting, but Feign Death I was a little too scared to tackle, and I don't really view it as top priority. I think I view Precision Strike as a little bit stronger than Deadeye too. Although Deadeye seems to do well in the mirror from what I've played, although that could just be me being bad or drunk or tired or whatever. Other cards that I didn't nerf that are notable, I didn't nerf Cat Witcher. I think Cat Witcher, when people were really bad at playing around this card, would often just get insane amounts of value on its own. But I think the Sentry nerf is a big nerf to Cat Witcher. The sentries are really big in making it sticky, and now there's an actual cost to running them. I don't think that it's bad design that this card can trade well with removal by waiting for the Adrenaline 4. In fact, I think that that's good design. I think that that's cool. It gives you a lot of flexibility with how you use the card. You can also opt to play it with Row Punish, or you can run it without Row Punish and just suffer through when your opponent stacks a row and hope they have cards that are row locked. I think both strategies are viable and fine. Like, the card is not that crazy of value, and it can be surprisingly awkward to use at times. But it is removal resilient, and it is kind of a unique engine. So I like the card. I wouldn't nerf it. Other card is Gaten. Gaten is often noted as totally putting Oak to shame. Honestly, it's a lot less flexible than Oak, though. The more I play with this card, the more I feel like it is genuinely balanced. It can be responsible for absolutely crazy protector swings, but they're tricky enough to engineer that, to me, it just feels like a payoff card being a payoff card, because you need to have a lot of units on the board, you need to be controlling the opponent's board to get value out of it being removal, but not so much that you can't ping stuff enough. And then you also have to have the Sentry ready in order to get really, really crazy value out of this card. A lot of times you do just kind of play this card as a smaller random Oak, and part of Oak's value is the removal, and Oak is also a little bit of a power crept card. So the card looks absolutely insane, but in practice it's fair. And it's also fairly unique. It's awkward to set up with Gezrus. You get a lot of interesting decisions about how to place your cards as a result of Gaten and Gezrus being your two main payoffs. I like the card enough. I will move on to I'll move on to NR. Just trying to read chat a little bit, but realistically, I'm not only thinking about high MMR players. I'm thinking about casual play to some extent. I have a little bit of a bias towards high MMR, but to me these changes make sense across the board. I don't know the full context of that discussion, but yeah, hopefully that says something. I don't know. What's NR Omega lol? Yeah. I mean, NR is actually more popular in higher levels than you would think. Witcher decks picked up a little bit of steam as people refined them a little bit. They're not as bad as I made fun of, sadly, even if that was in part due to people running disgusting-ass Igni and Nirden. And yeah, there are neutral changes coming, so NR is not getting strictly buffed, because, spoiler alert, me no like Igni and Nirden, me go yeet. But I did, other than that, give one pretty notable buff to a very, very disappointing card. The premium's not disappointing. I like the premium quite a lot. That's a nice entry. Yeep. 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 So this card, Archgriffin, is a card that screams that it needs a rework, right? Because with the current design, say that you buffed this card enough for it to be good. I would say that this card could start to be considered playable at 9 for 10. But at that point, you've completely changed the purpose of the card. Like, this card is a dreamer card, right? This card is trying to be super big. At 9 for 10, the card is basically saying, yeah, I can be played multiple times. And as a total failsafe, if my, like, as a failsafe, and I'm, like, just going to trade with a removal, like, 95% of the time. And then occasionally I'm going to run into a deck that doesn't have that removal, and I'm just going to auto-win the game by, like, being boosted to, like, 50 billion points. Like, that's just not a satisfying card. It has fuck all to do with NR Witchers, too. The only Witcher that synergizes with this card significantly is the Ranger. The Ranger is the trashiest one. It's incredibly difficult for me to see how enemy units are supposed to appear, then you're supposed to play a Ranger, then it's supposed to live, then you're supposed to play an Archgriffin in that order. The Archgriffin maybe will start already on the board and you'll be playing like other boosts and stuff. It's just really weird. To be fair, I mentioned earlier, the Griffin Witchers lack a bit of a direction to me. Adept is trying to do shields, and it's trying to do token conversion. Mentor is a mulligan card that sort of hand buffs, but it hand buffs randomly, so you can't synergize with it. Ranger wants enemy units on a row, as like sort of a pseudo row punish. And what even is the last one? Oh yeah, the regular Witcher wants to be veiled or just wants to do damage and control the board a little bit. Like there's a ton of confusion. Like to me, the Griffin Witcher bronzes just feel like a collective pile. It kind of works because of Vesemir and Erland and like options to play like a lot of boosty cards. And like the Adept is just standalone a crazy good card, which is something that I pointed out during my patch review. I maybe got a little overexcited about NR on the whole as a result of Adept and Keldar. But those cards really are crazy in this deck. They definitely carry it to sort of viability. But to me, the archetype is very confused. I'd maybe like to go through and rework it at some point. It just doesn't feel like it knows what it's trying to do other than play points because, haha, my cards are Witchers. So, in that sense, I couldn't think of how to make Archgriffin like flavorful in terms of it works with the Bronze Witchers either. I didn't really feel like that was fair for me to have to do, given that the current Archgriffin has no synergy with the current Bronze Witchers, and the archetype is a pile. Like, this card would want to be played in like a boost deck that's running like packs and triangle within the triangle and like drummers and shit like that, rather than like a Witcher deck. So my design kind of kept the flavor of original Archgriffin to some extent, in terms of it wants to be boosted a lot, it wants to go kind of tall, but it makes the card much, much better. Honestly, to the point where I would be a little scared of printing this card. It might need a little bit of a nerf. I retained the 5 for 10 stat line. Whenever Archgriffin receives... The new effect is whenever Archgriffin... I should probably post it in Twitch chat. Just so that it's easier to reference. Yeah, posted the thing. Whenever Archgriffin receives a boost, it boosts itself by 1. Pretty useless effect. It's a tridem with a worse distribution. The purpose of the card, Adrenaline 2, also boost adjacent units by 1. Immediately, no. Visigoda pile, funny that you mentioned that. Literally, the only other NR card I have changed under NR is Visigoda, with the status of yeeted. I want to make it clear, if I didn't rework Archgriffin in the way that I did, I would still yeet Visigoda. I would just yeet Visigoda about half a page later, on my long-term health changes. Visigoda is just not a healthy card. Like, period. And it's actually more damaging to casuals than competitive players. Like, competitive players very, very rarely see a Visigoda. Visigoda will just bully the shit out of you if you're a first-time Gwent player and you don't know what it does and you don't expect it. and you're playing like your own game plan. Like, yeah, I'm just gonna we have the chat's very torn on this. It's very interesting to see how people are going like full on like whenever I look at the chat for like the first four factions that I assume are going to be like the really controversial ones because they're like the big ones. People like really agree with my changes, and then I get to NR and I touch literal fucking Archgriffin, which I assume is like the most uncontroversial thing ever because the card is Omega dog shit and the mechanic is Omega stupid. And I'm like immediate filled with nofers. It's pretty interesting. Like, I respect your opinion, but fuck you, chat. Alright, SY, let's go. So SY. SY is really weird. SY is seeing virtually no play at top level. When it is played, it's usually passy, with either a pretty limited number of new cards or no new cards. However, I think that makes it way too easy to conclude that the new cards are all too weak. The new cards, Syndicate is a weird faction. The faction has spenders as a core mechanic. There were 0 bronze spenders printed in the expansion, and the only gold spender is once per turn and extremely easy to remove. So yeah, I think Self-Poison was more doomed to fail than it was weak. A lot of cards in Self-Poison were genuinely strong when I played them. A little tricky to make work. There are some other problems with Self-Poison, but that's where I will be getting into my changes. One of them is obviously regular poison. Regular poison is pretty keckweight. One more card with hideout effect and you're sold. You're on the right track. It's not a hideout effect, but yeah. I do have a card that attempts to tackle that problem a little bit. So first rework, I think this is a pretty agreeable one. Back Alley Chemist. I have not been reworking old cards. However, I consider this card a self-poison card, and self-poison was not a real thing until now, so I consider it effectively an expansion card, because there was just no reason to run this besides literal Wretched Addict until now. So Back Alley Chemist is a fairly inflexible deploy card. You have to play the card you want to poison first, which in the case of things like Failed Experiment means that you're losing a coin of value. It makes it very clunky. The card can be removed, yada yada yada. So I wanted to rectify this and simultaneously solve the spender problem. Back Alley Chemist, I'm giving Profit 2 and a more tame version of the Gellert ability, which is Fee 2, poison an allied unit, and boost it by 2. So basically, this card can be played proactively, and when you play it proactively, it develops as a spender, and it has the flexibility to gain 2 coins. So it's a big buff in raw value. But the spending ability is not too flexible. It is still a once per turn ability. So you profit 2, and then if you spend the 2 coins, you are poisoning a unit and boosting it by 2, so it's the same value, but you do get the upside of you can do it again multiple times. So this card is in every case buffed. In some cases pretty significantly buffed. I guess technically if you're capped out on coins, in theory it could be nerfed. But it's a big buff to a completely unplayed card. It's not a raw value buff, it's kind of more of a technicality flexibility buff. I think it would be a good change, so that there is at least a bronze spender for self-poison in some capacity. You missed the... yeah, whatever. You missed the change. This card, instead of just being a deploy effect, it has Profit 2 and Fee 2 with cooldown 1 to give an allied unit poison and boost it by 2. So it's a tamer Gellert as a bronze. Ping. Please sup me, baby. Donated $30. Shit. Happy New Year. Keep up the good work and praise us with more nice text. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Cool. Is self-poison any good? Currently it's not any good, in terms of how it does in the meta. Keeping deploy or no? Not keeping deploy. It completely removes the deploy. This is the same raw value, but you can use it multiple times and you can develop it proactively as a spender threat that profits too, instead of being forced to play another card first and then target it with this. Like, when you factor in the fact that it becomes a spender cards inherently become more value. It's basically it's kind of like the Jacques buff in a way, although it's a less flexible spender than Jacques. But it's also almost bigger because it lets you play the card proactively. The card will suddenly be good. The card will suddenly be good, for sure. Like, no doubt in my mind. Next buff I have is to Gellert. I think after printing that change to Back Alley Chemist, it's only fair that Gellert gets buffed as well. The card starts to look a little bit lackluster compared to Chemist, given that Chemist is so non-committal at 4p. And I think there should be a gold spender with this sort of effect too. Like, the effect is really important for a self-poison deck, that you be able to self-poison units. My change will seem like maybe a little bit of a nerf to some other cards, but on Gellert it is definitely a buff. The Profit 2 is going to Profit 1, and the 5 is going to 6. Gellert will be a 6 strength unit. It'll be significantly harder to kill. It's really... God damn it, chat. Yeah, 6 power, like, at 5 it's so non-committal to kill. At 6 it's still very killable, but it's not... It costs something to kill it. And this card will trade quite efficiently with the removal. This card already traded efficiently enough with removal to be playable. The problem with this card was that there was no backup for it whatsoever. So between this card being a little bit more sticky and Back Alley Chemist, you should be able to self-poison stuff more reliably. And that should be a big deal, especially for Failed Experiment, which was just... Even in self-poison, this card just wasn't making it, because it was so hard to actually self-poison same turn. It was really, really awkward. But this card's not bad raw value. It could be tried again. Other change, Stolen Mutagens. Stolen Mutagens is really weird to me. I like the idea of the card a lot. But what's weird to me about Stolen Mutagens is that it's a flexibility card that's very inflexible with when you need to play it. Like, you want to have 3 Salamandra units. 3 Salamandra units is hard. People like to remove your cards decently often in Gwent sometimes. And even just literally having 3 Salamandra units, that makes sense to play round 1. Probably that are, like, probably bronzes, or maybe in some cases you'd be willing to commit Roland or Gellert, etc., etc. Can be quite difficult with all of the other cards that syndicates need to run. So I just gave this a very small push. The card is strong enough. It's not an issue of this card not being strong enough per se. It's good in a self-poison deck. But I lowered this to 2 Salamandra units, so that it's at least a little bit more playable. The red mutagen especially is like... Tourney Joust type effects are usually valuable very early into the round. By the time you have 3 Salamandra units, it's pretty unlikely you would need to Tourney Joust something. So I would hope that would help it a little. Honestly, I could see this literally being if you control a Salamandra unit, but that's a really strong card at that point. Red should be buffed. I don't really agree with that. Red is emergency removal. I think it's fine. If red was a rebuke, this card would be too good for sure. Like, I don't want this card to be just like Omega busted TM. Like, it's a flexibility card that can play for, like, even like more value than the individual options are worth. Like, this can be Eavesdrop +3 plus a self-poison, or Tourney Joust +3, or like Veil, which is very useful in the Salamander deck, +3. Like, it's not a matter of the payoff not being good. It's a matter of 5p being a little awkward, and, like, more importantly, just this condition being really hard. Yeah. Plus possible Intimidate procs, since Self-Poison realistically isn't really going to have Intimidate. The card is like too self-poison-y for Intimidate most of the time. Yo, Tilt Bro, thank you for the raid. With Line Pockets, it can be worth 9. Yeah, technically it can. Yeah, so that's a change. And then the big change. Oh, God. The Twitch chat was up in orange about their precious Archgriffin being changed. How mad is Twitch going to be if I call Fallen Rayla like one of the biggest disappointments of the expansion? God. Chat's going to simp so hard for Rayla. But Rayla at least had a direction. I kept the flavor of Rayla. I improved the shit out of Rayla. Alright, I'll hover the premium. So Rayla has a complicated enough effect that I will paste it. It's not Adrenaline 4. Oh yeah, it's Adrenaline 4, baby. Removed Adrenaline. Oh yeah, removed Adrenaline, baby. No, y'all aren't tackling the core issue. The core issue of this problem is that it's not a reliable Salamander finisher, because all of the power is in one unit. It doesn't do anything besides self-boost. It's incredibly clunky. It's 11 provisions, so it's just auto-trading down with, like, any removal. So it gets feet. Nope, you're wrong. You're so wrong. I reworked the shit out of this card. This card is gonna be really good now. Yeah, so what I did, I made Fallen Rayla a 6. I removed the Prophet and the Tribute entirely. I made it a self-poison card. Chad is pogging off. Pog. I did it. I didn't get the Archgriffin treatment. So yeah, this is the quote unquote second hideout. Chad is just a simp for Archgriffin. Alright. I guess I'll just accept it. There's nothing I can do about it. Yeah. So the Adrenaline 3 got moved to a deploy effect. Basically, it's meant the card can be more realistically played without Adrenaline and without having to worry about Adrenaline. But it does gain a bonus for being played with Adrenaline 3, which is that it self-poisons. And you might be thinking, maybe that's not what you want. It could get regular poisoned. However, it has an ability, and the ability is pretty good. Whenever an ally unit is poisoned during your turn, not enemy turns, if it worked during enemy turns, it would hard brick enemy poisons, and that is kind of maybe not great. But there is still counterplay to enemy poisons in the sense that you can hide out poisons that are played as long as they are not played on poisoned units. Whenever an allied unit is poisoned during your turn, give it Veil and boost it by 2. Yeah, so that Salamander OTK, though. Does it Veil Self? I legitimately don't know from the wording. Yeah, this card legitimately has more synergy with every single portion of the self-poison package. This card still works with Abomination. Abomination will purify the Veil. This card makes it way easier to poison failed experiments against poisons. Like, you can actually play the card now against regular poisons. With single Salamander, you don't have to literally wait until you play Salamander to poison your self-poison cards. With double Salamander, you get Veils. And, like, if you somehow manage to coordinate Fallen Rayla and Fallen Rayla Lives and 2 salamanders, yeah, you just win the game. And like, yeah, is that broken? No, not really. I don't think so. Between round mechanics and like a simple removal sort of breaking that, I would like to know the wording. Also, Fallen Rayla trades less horribly into tall removal because you can actually use the card on the turn it's played. Like, the self-poison can activate things like Roland, potentially, if you get the self-poison on Rayla. And you can also just gain points from using a Gellert or a Chemist on the same turn. So the card at least does something. Yeah. I liked my Fallen Rayla rework. Glad chat doesn't hate it. Yeah. I don't know if Rayla works on herself. My intention kinda was that it was, but the thing that gets really interesting is you look at the wording of Roland. Adrenaline 5. Whenever an allied unit is poisoned, gain 2 coins itself. That works on Roland. If Roland gets poisoned, you gain 2 coins. Read Gellert. Poison an allied unit and boost it by 2. Gellert can't self-poison. These both just say an allied. So, get fucked. Yeah. My intent was for Rayla to work on herself. I think that would be cool. Would that be broken? I don't know. I don't think it would, but it would make the card very good when played with Adrenaline, and it would trade pretty well with removal. I think the card can be tried. I don't really think it will be too crazy. You know, it kind of sucks to not have access to, like, a testing environment. You know, testing environments are pretty neat. But I do my best, Pepe Smile. To me, it felt like the missing piece. Like, it just solves pretty much every issue you could think of with self-poison. But it is still only one card, so it can't be played in multiple rounds and just magically makes self-poison's problems go all away for the entire game in BOP. Okay, and then we have neutrals. So this is not in the order that I have the patch notes listed on my spreadsheet, or on my script or whatever, but I'll start with the fun ones that are obvious. Igni and Yurden completely yeeted. Yeah, I've never really hidden that I don't like those cards. They are the reason that pretty much every pro is arguing for open deck list. Personally, I would not be a big fan of open deck list. I feel like that it sort of takes away sort of a core element of a card game being a card game. It's annoying to have to look at deck lists. And it sort of just encourages people to be like meta slaves, unless they can really, really find like some really good secret. Like, deck building is still possible in open list. I don't want to give that impression, but I am worried that people will try less. And obviously, as a deck builder, I think it's really cool when people try to build decks. So for ladder, I would like to see closed deck list given that cards like Igni and Yurden that are not actual real deck building, but just random surprise Keck W cards that can go into any deck and just win or lose the game for you because you don't have enough talent to build a deck that can win your game, that those cards get dealt with. Yeah. Another card that I decided to yeet, and this one hurts a little bit. I yeeted Angolim. Angolim was fun for 1 month, and really, really dumb as shit. This is basically the last bomb heaver. Yeah. It hurts because I made the Angolim deck, but it is such a dumb fucking card. Like, you mauled so hard at high MMR when there were enough people playing Assimilate that cutting an artifact from any deck is just viable, and you just play a 3 for 10 and lose the fucking game. There are ways to try to balance this card. I don't hate it in theory as an Assimilate payoff, but the metagaming of this card is so fucking horrible. It adds too much pressure onto enemy decks when this card is actually good. And it's just not a tech that really needs to exist. Yeah. Other neutral changes. The other buff to NR Witchers that is more direct than Archgriffin. Archgriffin doesn't really so much go into Witcher NR. It could go into any deck that runs Uprising if you built around it enough. It might change how Witcher NR looked a little bit, but it would be more of like a shield wall card. Eskel, Vesemir, and Lambert, I just flat out removed Adrenaline. To me, there are two uses of Adrenaline from this expansion, and one's really good and one's really not that good. The really good use of Adrenaline is allowing CDPR to print cards that they otherwise couldn't print. The not so good use of Adrenaline is, hey look, Witchers, Adrenaline. I like the fact that the cards that they are printing are Witcher themed. I think it's good that Adrenaline mostly be kept on Witchers. I'm not suggesting that they magically fix old cards with Adrenaline to update them. I think cards everywhere having Adrenaline would be like a little too much. And at some point, if too many cards have Adrenaline, like the hand will kind of play itself. Like you could just have a hand consisting of an Adrenaline 9 card, an Adrenaline 8 card, an Adrenaline 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, blah, blah, blah. No, I'm not removing the Adrenaline from Vesemir. Vesemir genuinely needs Adrenaline 5, and the card is fine with it. The card would be too boring if it did not have Adrenaline, because it would guarantee that you can get the carryover down. And the carryover can be pretty powerful. The Vesemir I'm talking about is this Vesemir. These cards having Adrenaline does nothing to, like, serves no purpose other than to irritate you. They're a finisher card. They're a big commitment play. Having to play these cards early often hurts anyway, with how Witchers will sometimes divide their rounds. And yet, for some reason, they need Adrenaline 4, and then you forget it exists, and then you play a 3-point Witcher, or a 4 or 5-point Witcher or whatever. And like the reason that is because this is such a natural card to slam. This card, when it's in your hand, just reads, "My board is empty, play me, play me. These are proactive units." Like, to me, it's a sign of bad design when so many people so consistently misplay Eskel, Vesemir, and Lambert, despite them being some of the simplest cards in the game. Like, it just feels bad as a card to not be able to play these cards when you want them to. I heard one person in my chat like a few days ago when I suggested this say like, "Oh, so you want these cards to be in every single deck again?" Ah, yes, these cards were too broken 2 years ago, when they were actually more powerful than they currently are. And yeah, they clearly needed to be nerfed to 2 for 8. Yeah, fucking dumbass. Thought I'd share that anecdote. I hope I don't need to like deconstruct that argument seriously. What other changes do I have? Oh, this is the fun one. This is the removal spree. Not literal removal of removals, but short-term changes. Every single remotely playable neutral removal card that is not based on a unit is being nerfed by a provision. I'd made this change uniform when I am aware that Heatwave is by far the strongest one. The reason I made that change uniform is because Heatwave is also the healthiest one relative to the others. Yeah, so Heatwave is going to 11 provisions. Curse of Corruption is going to 10 provisions. Becker's Rockslide is going to 9 provisions. Spores is going to 5 provisions. Artifact Compression, mostly for consistency, not because it's too powerful or anything like that, is going to 6 provisions. And you'll note that all of these cards are not too powerful. It's that they're neutral cards, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Yeah, okay, that's the end of the list. Yeah, all of those cards are being nerfed. And you might be like, Keck, wait, why do those cards need nerfs? They're not that good. It's simply because they should be even worse than they are. These cards make for too good of filler rather than fulfilling a very specific niche. Heatwave is the card out of the cards that I just named that in a healthy meta should be played somewhat. The reason that Heatwave should be played somewhat is because this card is basically, like, it's very clear what this card wants to be, right? This card wants to be an emergency tall removal for a deck in a faction that has absolutely no option for removal. You should have to pay a real premium for that. But a lot of factions just flat out don't have anything. And when they do have things, they're almost comparably expensive to Heatwave, and they have some sort of condition. And this leads to Heatwave being in 5 out of 6 of the factions in a lot of cases. Like, I can name decks in every faction but Nilfgaard that play Heatwave, and I briefly saw people experimenting with running both Invo and Heatwave and Nilfgaard. Yeah. Would I change Dash? That's a good long term. I don't consider Dash an immediate power problem, but honestly, thank you for the suggestion. I am going to throw that into my long term. I don't like Siri Dash at all. Yeah. So Heatwave would make sense if it sometimes got played in a monsters deck that couldn't utilize Imlerith's Wrath, or in a Scoia'tael deck that didn't want to spec into poisons because the poisons were too expensive for the ST deck. The other factions should all have good enough tools, TM, relative to Heatwave, but with the current balancing of the card, Heatwave looks favorable compared to a lot of options. NR? Maybe Full Test at 11 provisions. Like, if Full Test played this at 11 provisions, I'd say fine. It's a deck that could really benefit from it because it struggles to get through things. But yeah, Onsace exists for a lot of other decks. Like, this is not a card that should never be played, but it should never be dominant. Like, this is a card that's being ran for power rather than consistency. My rule for neutral cards is there are 3 big rules. One is that it should have an argument to be played in multiple factions. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be ran in multiple factions, but it should. If I were a new player and I saw the card, I shouldn't think, oh, this is a Scoia'tael card, or oh, this is a Monsters card. I should think that this card might be something I consider regardless of what my deck is, to some extent. Like, whether it be a card like Morale, where it's like, obviously this card is just a general part of any poison package in any of the 3 factions. Or whether it just be, like regardless of what the neutral card is, that should be true. Karathi Heatwave fits that. Yeah, Ethereal is a good example of a card that doesn't fit that. Having a card printed as a neutral so that it can't be ran in Devotion is fucking dumb. And it's one of the reasons I don't like Devotion as an idea. The second rule for neutral cards should be that tutor cards are preferred over power cards. Like consistency tools, supporting tools, enablers should be neutrals that are enablers should be better than neutrals that are payoffs. Heatwave is like less of an enabler. You could argue that it's sort of an enabler in the sense that it really just covers your weak spot. It's not there to aggressively push your deck forward. But this is a gold. You have to draw it when you put it in your deck. It is very important. Like, it's a very important part of your deck. It's played because it will trade well with something. It's not played because it will tutor your other card that will do something that will be more faction oriented. If you have cards that are neutral and that are making up a core part of your deck, that means that factions will become more homogenized, and that basically that removes a large part of the variety of the game. The game gets tailored much quicker if there are 6 versions of neutral decks than if there are 6 different factions. The third rule... Fuck, I'm too tired. I forgot the third rule. I was gonna come up with some bullshit third rule, man. Fuck. God damn it. I'm so proud of myself, too. Yeah. Oh my god. Now that scenarios have Doom, should Heatwave banish or just destroy? I'm okay with the banish, especially if it goes to 11. It makes the card feel a tiny bit less vanilla, too. I don't really mind it. It does sometimes hurt cards, but it also... I would argue that that's better. On average, it's better. Like, the one situation where it really sucks is when a Yigurn gets Heatwaved. But against stuff like Lippy, being able to Heatwave Aceres, I would argue, is a good interaction. Like having kind of weird ways to interact with cards that are not necessary, like with decks that are not necessarily going super tall to get some value out of it. You swear Karathi should be 12? Karathi was 12, and it saw no play in a meta where cards were much weaker. People might have not been realizing what they were doing, TM. But yeah, 11 provisions is a much bigger nerf than it seems. You're kind of just... Yeah, no. Like, maybe a patch or two ago, the phrase Karathi meta would make more sense. But Karathi meta's a little extreme for what we're feeling right now. Yeah. So Heatwave, yeah. The other cards, I just honestly don't think should be played. I don't think there should be much redundancy. Like, these cards are literally used to just fill space and burn your way down with 1-for-1s up to until you can play some finisher card that is too many points for your opponent to handle. Curse of Corruption, I mean, in theory, can be a provision cheaper than Heatwave if you run the perfect deck for it. But honestly, like, I can't think of a way to make this card worth playing over Heatwave, but also not too cheap to the point where it's too efficient for it to be a neutral card. So I would rather this card just be bad. So I made it bad. At 10p, this card will probably just be bad. Good. Kind of same story for Rock Slide. I think Rock Slide, just because it rhymes with Pog Slide, Twitch is a little bit bigger of a fan of it. You know, Twitch is a very special organism. Hey Darnak, what up? Yeah. But with that being said, the card is still too good. I would actually argue it's better than Cock, more deserving of the 1p nerf. It's not strictly worse than Cock, even if both were 9, but Cock should be 10 too. Spores. My main justification for Spores is right now it costs absolutely nothing to tech this card, except that randomly you'll draw a 4p that plays for like absolutely nothing and mauled the shit out of yourself. Making Spores 5p means that you are actually willing to put some level of investment into playing a cheap removal tech. Probably in practice it means the card isn't played, because a big part of why it's played is that it's 4p. And to that, again, I say good. Not every card is made to be played, especially when we're talking neutrals. And then artifact compression, I mentioned that for consistency, I don't think it's good to have artifact compression just creeping spores. Although you could argue it doesn't strictly creep spores, because spores will go on to Triss Telekinesis, which is something that you could take advantage of. But in practice, it creeps spores. Make it 6. It's not like I want this card to be played. I've seen it played a bit too, as like an alternative to spores. Who knows, maybe someone will pick it over spores at 6, if spores is 5. But yeah, basically, this is just me targeting a type of card. I was almost tempted to go like the full distance here and revert Thunder to 6p, which it used to be. But I think that's a little much, given that at this point every faction has a Thunder anyway. Yeah. Okay. 2 other changes. Geralt is the only completely non-unit based removal card that I tweaked. It's like no unity enough that I felt the need to tweak it, but it's not as tied to possible archetypes as something like Professional. Geralt is pretty strong. Like, it's not like pretty strong as in like, oh, it's in the meta a lot, but it's pretty strong like it's on par with the cards that we're nerfing here. I didn't give this card a provision. I made this destroy a unit with 10 or more power for 10. The design becomes more elegant. It's a huge point of TA. Like, quite often you'll be forced to TA into Leo or Geralt. At 10, it's a lot easier for you to TA a 4 than it is for you to TA a 3. Some decks just won't have 3s. Personally, I don't like the design of this card. I don't see why Gwent needs Big Game Hunter. It just feels like a flawed card for this game, and I mean, Big Game Hunter was a flawed card for that game. But I'm far too lazy to nerf it or rework it or whatever. Yeah, Leo is still targeting 9s in my patch. Faction card being better than neutral card. Oh wait, that's how it's supposed to work. Yeah. And then the final neutral change I made was to Oniromancy. This is one you'll be interested to know. I put some of the most time into my Oniromancy change. It's not because it was hard to think up, but it was because I actually did math on actual math on what provision costs to make this card. And my conclusion was that, fuck, it really, really swings with the tiniest change of my assumptions. But basically what I tried to do, I knew what I wanted my fix to be. Oniromancy is the ultimate consistency card. It's an echo card that you can play twice. It can play any card from your deck, but it can't fucking play itself to save its life. Same provisions, no echo, yikes. That's really weak. No. My change is this card gets more provisions and it starts in your hand. because then you are paying an absolutely massive cost for the ultimate consistency tool. It's a good change, but it's easy to say that, right? The question is just, how many more provisions do you need to make that fair? And the good news is, there's math. And this is actually something that's solvable, TM, assuming that you have good assumptions, or that you have empirical data to fill in those assumptions. About 24p. Yeah. So basically what I did, and I'm not sure how to share this on screen, I'm far too lazy to figure out how to share this on screen, is that Oniromancy, you draw it in round 1 a calculatable amount of the time. I just assumed 13 and 25. I think most decks that have Oniromancy in them hard mull for it if they don't have it in hand, at least if we're assuming a good player. So in the cases where you draw Oniromancy in round 1, it is equivalent to the new Oniromancy. So if you assume values for Oniromancy in round 2, round 3, and when you don't draw it, you can calculate the probability of each of those states happening depending on the amount of thinning that you do. And you can then plug that into an algebraic expression in order to calculate how many provisions the new Oniromancy should be worth. Like, basically, you say that, like, it's basically just, like, let me just pull up my Wolfram Alpha thing, because I plugged it into Wolfram Alpha and it was fun, but people are going to see the number and then be like, hey, look, number, and then have discussion. But to me, the problem was the assumptions. Like, the assumptions, it sounds really cute. It was a really cool mental exercise. I'm glad I did it, because it felt like I was at least being more objective with trying to balance the card. But in the end, it's still a crapshoot. What I learned is that 15 was the wrong number. My hypothesis was 15 provisions. 15 provisions is too cheap. This card should either cost 16 or 17 provisions. I went with 16 because of 2 reasons. Number 1, I think the card is cool. I wanted to be a little bit more generous with it. The only thing that's uncool about the card is not drawing it. When you actually draw the card, it enables a much more combo-oriented gameplay, and I think that that's healthy for the game. A lot of more interesting decks came out when Oniromancy came out. And the second reason is that the Oniromancy change is also an indirect nerf to Lippy, inherently. So I would not be worried about buffing Oniromancy in the case of Lippy. And the reason why this Oniromancy change would be a nerf to Lippy, even if the card maybe got a tiny bit stronger across the board, is because Lippy works differently with Oniromancy. A big part of the reason why Oniromancy is the tutor of choice in Lippy is because if you fail the skill check of drawing the Oniromancy in round 2 or round 3 when you play the Lippy, in round 2 you can play the Lippy and then get the Oniromancy in your hand and have the Ceres ready guaranteed. So there is less value to be gained by drawing Oniromancy in round 1, because you will always have the Oniromancy ready for round 3 when you really, really need a tutor for your Ceres finisher that is difficult to draw into. Obviously, if you still decide to play Oniromancy in Lippy, you'll reliably get Ceres round 1. If you're willing to pay 16 fucking provisions, I think that's a good thing. Like, that's an expensive-ass card. Were thoughts of Lippy discussed? Yes, I nerfed Hernkaduk. I did not nerf Lippy or Ceres. I nerfed a lot of the neutral cards that go into the process of filling for Lippy. I think that filler cards for Lippy should be Skellige cards. Like, ultimately, Lippy, with how the archetype is structured, will have some amount of thinning, or filler. But I would like to see it be the core Lippy cards, some of which can be neutral, plus Skellige fillers. It's really fucking dumb that it's just removal.pile in the best build. which is one reason why I went on the mass removal spree. Yeah. 16p Oniro and Videx. I mean, yeah, that's a deck you would be willing to pay 16p for Oniro in, right? It's a good example. It's like, sure, you get the Oniro. You don't necessarily need the provisions. You could argue it's almost a buff to Vi in that case, because Vi will probably, like, the values of Oniro in round 1, 2, and 3 differ depending on the deck that you're playing. And obviously the odds differ depending on the amount of thinning that is not Oniromancy that you're running. So it's a really tricky card to balance. But my best guess was 16 in the end. I found that with one thinning, I think that it came out to around like 16.4 when I assumed that like with one thinning in round 1, it came out to around 16.4 provisions when I assumed that Oniromancy in round 2 was worth 13, in round 3 it was worth 10, and when it was in the deck it was worth 6 because it's basically role-playing as a roughly average card but a slightly below average card with how keeping cards works. Like, these were all estimates. In the end, it was stupid for me to do. Like, just empirically being a pro player and having played with the card and just kind of eyeballing an idea might have been a little better. But it was clear that I was off. I at least learned a little bit by doing it. I think that 15 would be too dangerous for the change. Like, a little over 1 in 8 games, you just miss Oniromancy with one thinning. It's not good when that happens. It is a significant buff to be able to get the card reliably. So yeah, that is my proposed change and the reasoning behind it. Yeah. And then I have some long-term health changes that these are changes that I flat out don't expect them to do, but changes that I hope are on their agenda at some point. Like, okay, realistically, a lot of these changes that I named already, I don't expect them to do, but I think they would objectively be good changes next month. The other ones are changes that I don't think would really have any impact on competitive play, but would be good for going into the future. First change. I'm sure the casual players will either love or hate this one. Fuck, where's Nilfgaard? Kahir. Bye, Kahir. Yeet the shit out of Kahir. Ivar. I gave this card a nerf before to make the card more well-rounded. Ultimately, I still think it's just inherently a swingy effect. I don't see why Regis Higher Vampire needs Zeal. I don't even see why Regis Higher Vampire needs to be. I could see this card just being repurposed instead of getting my nerf treatment. But it's like borderline enough that I came up with a nerf for it too that I liked. To make the card less swingy more than anything. It's not that this card is too good, but it's that it's like, it's just so fucking needless. Oh my god. I could give a better argument if I wasn't so fucking tired, but just looking at this card makes me mold. Siri Dash, someone suggested that earlier. I agree. Imagine changing Siri Dash by Siri Dash. I love just being able to do that. Just wave it away with magic and friendship. This is the greatest thing about what I can do. And then some general goals. In general, I would want the neutral pool to have fewer cards in it, unless there are going to be more designs printed here, to make the game more accessible. Like, I think that it's fine that cards are forgotten about, but if they're forgotten about, they should be forgotten about, and not just sitting here with like a giant pile of cards to learn for a new player. I would like to see there be either, like, obviously if they went through and updated these neutral cards, I would say great. Like, that would be ideal. But I don't really view it as feasible or a good, like, I don't really feel it as like a good return on investment. So I would rather them take the steps that are good return on investment first, like making relevant balance changes. Given that I think more work could be done there. So I would say just clean up the neutral pool would be ideal. I would like to see some of the cards that are just super creeped out. Like, for example, Enraged Ifrit is just weaker Betsy, which is already struggling to see play, but this card I could at least understand. It's weird to see a neutral card creeping a neutral card. Things like that. Scenarios are a thing that exist still. This is a problem where at this point it's clear that they're never going to solve it. That's their solution to solving the problem. And honestly, with how much they've crept the game, I don't hate that. But they are one per faction, and they are really imbalanced with each other. I also almost think the game, like, yeah, I don't know how I feel about scenarios. I don't like the solution of making them devotion. I don't like devotion for other reasons. But I don't want to go too much into that. And at this point, devotion is devotion. It's hardly something where I'd be like, oh, long term they need to remove devotion. But I certainly wouldn't want them to just slap devotion as a solution to all of the game's problems moving forward. I don't really feel like it would work. Yeah, so I said that very vaguely. I'm not really saying anything useful there, to be honest. I don't have a good solution, but it might be something to revisit. There are lots and lots of options for buffs and reworks, which I've said multiple times, but it goes way beyond scope. This was long enough. My throat's hurting a bit. And then finally, new idea for a syndicate leader. I call it mild card. Gain 5 coins, then place a bounty on an enemy unit. Justice for wild card, goddammit. Imagine nerfing a 2-card per turn leader that could literally just be an effect. Like, honestly, I preferred wild card. Wild card was a better leader than mild card. But fuck it. If you're gonna make this stupid ass rule, give me back my bounty leader. I also had regular withdrawal and some stupid name for Death Shadow that I couldn't think of a name for, and neither could Driftbling. Not that Driftbling really had much influence on this patch note thing. He kind of just read it for proofreading. But then saw my mild card and was like, Death Shadow is a thing because like he has a big attachment to Death Shadow, and so did I. He knew I built the Kiki deck, and like Ferd was a really big Kiki player and whatnot. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a more Peepo riot. Maybe a bit of a more lighthearted change to end on. But I do genuinely also think it would be a good change for Wildcard is the most egregious offense. Death Shadow, you could argue, could be difficult to keep going into the future, even though I would argue that it was pretty specific in terms of how it was used and quite hard to use, and just made a lot of cool archetypes. And strategic withdrawal, I mean, sort of similar story there, I think. Yeah.